Hey everybody, Michaela O'Donnell here, Executive Director for the Max Dupree Center for Leadership at Fuller Seminary. This video is about rest. We actually talk a lot about rest here at the Dupree Center, and for good reason. Rest is part of God's design from the beginning, yet for many of us, Sabbath is one of the most elusive Christian practices. We are working in arguably the noisiest and busiest era of human existence. And it's not just the volume, it's not just that all these things are coming at us. The very nature of our work has changed. It follows us home. Technology keeps us perpetually connected. Many of us carry responsibilities that are they're complex. They're emotionally and mentally difficult to put down. That is hardly a context in which it's easy to rest. So I don't think that I've just come to believe over time that the greatest obstacle to rest is not actually our lack of self-discipline. It's not our needing better habits, needing better boundaries. Though those things, they matter. It's that we live and we lead within systems that reward speed, productivity, and constant availability. It's that today's work is much more complex. And that's not even just a comparison. The work today is complex, it's multifaceted, it's happening on different levels and very quickly, which makes it harder to turn off when we're off the clock, so to say. So yeah, conversations on rest end up feeling really practical, really fast. And that, we tell people to take a day off, to turn off notifications, to set better boundaries, to go on vacation. And those are all good practices. They matter, but they're not enough. And I don't mean that we need to do more, just sort of a zooming out for a second. What if the greatest obstacle to rest isn't an individual problem at all? What if it's that we've been formed, again, by these systems that prioritize productivity, demand our availability, and reward us for our ability to just kind of keep going on and on? Um, this all of the ecosystems, all of the environments that we live in, all the people that we're connected to, they don't just shape what we do, they shape what we come to believe is normal. Um, the environments that think about the specific places that you've worked, especially your first job, your second job, they teach us what it means to be a good employee. They teach us what it means to be a good leader. We think about how this transfers over to the home. If for people who have children, our systems teach us what a committed parent looks like, right? And how to be a good sibling or a good community volunteer, a good church member, a good soccer coach, whatever the role is. These ecosystems that we live within end up having these informal norms about what it means to be good at that. And one of those is doing more is good. That is often an unwritten rule in many of the patterns and the rhythms of the ways that we live. So maybe the question is not just, and I want to move us in this video at least beyond how do I rest, right? And we have tons of stuff at the Dupree Center that gets after that question. But I want to move it from how do I rest to how do we practice God's rhythms in a world that's organized around very different values, right? How do we practice God's rhythms in a world organized around very different values? In the scriptures, rest is not primarily a matter of private spirituality. It's a social construct, a social practice. In Exodus, when we have God, giving the commandments, the fourth commandment, Exodus 20:10 reads, "You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female servant, your livestock, or the foreigner residing in your towns." This commandment is grounded in God's own rhythm of work and rest found in Genesis. God did a lot of working in the creating of the heavens and the earth. And then in the rhythm of that act of poetry that we get in Genesis, which recounts how God made the heavens and earth, we see that God rested on the seventh day. In that recounting and bringing it into the commandments, Sabbath isn't framed as an individual privilege. It's for not only heads of household, but for children, for people who are working or who are enslaved as part of the household, for animals, for the foreigner, the person visiting, or the person that's, for whatever reason, part of your town, the outsider, essentially. Sabbath is for everybody. Rest is for everybody. The implication here is striking, right? It's not only for the person who sort of controls the economic engine or hub of a system. It's for anybody that's in that, which means that the role actually for those with responsibility, the heads of household in that situation, is to create the conditions in which others can rest too, to create the conditions in which others can rest too. Then in Deuteronomy, right, we get in Deuteronomy 5, Moses, in talking to the Israelites who have just endured and been brought out of enslavement in Egypt, Moses repeats the Sabbath commandment, okay? But this time he gives a bit of a different spin on it, not in a contradictory way, but in a way that kind of widens our imagination. He reminds Israel, remember that you were enslaved in Egypt and that the Lord your God brought you out of there. Therefore, the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day. When Moses reminds Israel of the Sabbath in Deuteronomy, he doesn't begin with that creative act of work and rest. It's not just that the rhythms of God are that you work and rest. He begins with reminding Israel of their enslavement. Why? Because in this sense, Sabbath is more than a rhythm of life and more than a rhythm of work. It's a refusal and a protest, actually, against the rhythms and logic of Pharaoh, who was exploitive and anxiety driven and the most demanding, unreasonable person depicted in sort of this work style that Moses is talking against. So Sabbath here is rooted in liberation, actually, liberated by God because we belong to God, because the Israelites belong to God. So Sabbath is and rest is both part of the lineage of the kingdom of God, both in the very first pages of scripture and the way that God has created workflow, but also as a reminder that we rest because we are not our own. We rest in the face of never-ending quotas or to-do lists or tasks that take up our space because we belong to God and we place our trust there. The people who, as Christians, we're called to order our time a bit differently, which is absolutely a radical countercultural shift at this point. Walter Brueggemann has a really great book. It's called Sabbath as Resistance. And he's the first one that really helped me start thinking about Sabbath as this communal act of resistance to the just kind of never ending stuff that comes at us. And he describes Sabbath as a resistance to the endless production demanded by Pharaoh's economy, resistance to the lie that our worth is measured by what we produce, and resistance to systems that never say enough, never call the end of the day, never call it quitting time, which essentially is what kind of feels like with all the input and the needs and the complex tasks that come our way. So every one of those every one of our communities has rhythms. Every community, whether it's work or school or family rhythms, every single one of our communities has rhythms that communicate something about what's expected, right? About what is norm, about productivity, about how people fit in, what is celebrated, what it takes to belong, what it takes to be appreciated or to feel secure, right? And as leaders, you don't simply inherit those systems. You have an outsized agency to either reinforce them or reshape them. And that's why I don't think of the Sabbath as simply about whether we take a day off, about whether we turn off the notifications, about whether we go on the vacation, though all those things are very important. They're important practical manifestations. It's about whether or not we're creating environments in which those acts are possible, right? And you might be listening to this and think, well, I don't have that kind of agency. That's a very real thing. So how then do you and do we take into our hands what is, I think about Stephen Covey's circles here, which I've named before these videos, where he talks about the circle of control, things we actually can act on, the circle of influence, and the circle of concern. So I would think about your place, let's say in your workplace. Are there acts where you, either for yourself, for your team, for your teammates, can do things? Hey, let's extend that deadline just a bit. Or, hey, I'm gonna be off on Saturday, sort of loudly telling people what you're doing to might create some space for others. Just be thinking about what is in your circle of control. It might be just a couple of small acts, but those end up being quite powerful oftentimes. The goal here is, as Christians, right, wherever we're planted, wherever God has called us, and at the Dupree Center, we believe that God has called people to all kinds of industries across all seasons of life to join in the work of God. And that our role as Christians, right? So this would be like where the Christian and leaders thing kind of intersects. Our role as Christians is to be a sign and a witness of what God is up to. So in our contribution to the capacity of people, capacity of our system to allow genuine rest of people, are those people then experiencing glimpses of God's kingdom? Are people experiencing a community where they are valued not simply for what they accomplish, but because they bear the image of God, whether or not they are Christians, whether or not the name of God is ever said or professed, whether or not that is said, that you bringing that theology into your work with you, caring for the rest and caring for the wholeness of the people that you engage with. Pharaoh's rhythms always demand more output, more availability, more achievement, more, quite literally in the scriptures, more doing with less to do it with, right? We know that feeling, like you've got to do, maybe there's been layoffs in your team, or you got to keep up with what's happening with AI. And all of a sudden it's, gosh, I actually am expected to do more with less. And that's a very real thing to exist in systems like that. And it's very, it's not often possible to say, I'm just going to sort of totally step away, because our paychecks and our livelihoods, and maybe the livelihoods of those who depend on us, are attached to that. So we're talking about anywhere from small little radical acts of resistance to this Pharaoh-like economy that may or may not show up in the variety of systems that we're part of. And if we find ourselves in any position with formal agency, whether as a parent, as a manager, as a teammate, how might we contribute to systems in which our neighbors, everybody in that system, just like in the Exodus commandment, are able to rest? God's rhythms remind us that we are beings before we're producers, we're beloved before we're successful, we're recipients of grace before we are achievers. So perhaps the invitation of Sabbath, of rest, like I'm kind of using those words interchangeably here. We unpack those other places at the Dupree Center. is not simply to become more rested people, though I think God delights in us becoming more rested people, but perhaps it's to become the kind of people, the kind of leaders, the kind of Christians, the kind of witnesses who make rest and therefore human flourishing more possible for others. I think that choosing God's rhythms is a radical act of trust in today's economy. And helping build communities that embody those rhythms, it might be one of the most important callings of Christians today.